Good afternoon. Happy Monday. I'm Zach Guzman, and join me on Wi-Fi PM today is Yahoo Finance's Brian Cheung. Good friend extraordinaire. Glad to have you along.
It's great to be here.
Glad to have you along.
Happy Monday, man.
Hey, happy Monday. It's a big Monday, not only because we're honoring today's veterans here in the U.S., but also because it's the first trading day of the week right now, and we're seeing the Dow up by about 13 points, the S&P right now off by about 7, and the NASDAQ off 17 as well. First today, though, I want to highlight the 24th consecutive week of violence that's escalating in Hong Kong after an unarmed protester was shot by police. The 21-year-old man had surgery at a nearby hospital but remains in critical condition, according to the hospital authority. This comes as CNN reports a man who argued with a group of pro-democracy protesters was covered in a flammable liquid and set on fire. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam says the city's government won't give in to violence, noting at least 60 people have been injured in the clashes so far. But Brian, I mean, we've talked about this for a long time, 24 weeks, a long time. People had hoped that the violence there might take a turn for the better when we talked about some of the concessions being made here, but clearly no signs of this going away.
No, not at all. And 24 weeks, this long overshadows what the previous kind of flare-up was back in 2014 and the what they call the umbrella revolution at the time. Also some kind of inflamed feelings in Hong Kong about what was then supposed to be the education coursework that was supposed to be in Hong Kong, the types of textbooks that they were allowed to use in that city. So this is a different story. Again, 24 weeks ago, it seems so long ago, this really coming or stemming from the extradition bill that Hong Kong had put forth that suggested maybe allowing China to take care of some of the cases that were happening in Hong Kong, which would effectively enact some sort of Chinese law over the territory of Hong Kong. The challenge here is that the violence does not appear to be abating, as you mentioned, Zach, and 24 weeks in, things have not calmed. There was some questions about maybe, hey, this will just kind of fizzle out like the umbrella revolution did in 2014, but now you have people getting seriously injured out here, and I think that this is the serious inflection point where you start to think about whether or not it's going to take more violence for the Chinese government to try to do something. Not saying that would be a good solution here, but you do wonder to what degree the protesters are now willing to, inflame things further with the Hong Kong police and with, the general rhetoric around the pro-China, pro-Hong Kong debate to maybe turn this into something that could get far uglier. Remains to be seen, but these first steps that we saw over the weekend with people being physically injured is not a good sign.
Or how much, it solidifies the movement as well, right? I mean, you think about the extremism or the extreme backlash on the part of police there trying to instill order. You think about the rallying cry when we talk about protest movements like this, when you do have people defending their right for democracy here, and that's really what that side would say.
Right.
But we've also watched the market action all this too. I mean, the Hang Seng down more than 2.5%. There are jitters there. I mean, Hong Kong, a major trading, beacon there for all of this going on. I mean, you've lived there. It's kind of the center point for all this.
Yeah, and you can make the argument that maybe 20 or 30 years ago, Hong Kong was an area or an economic zone in that Pearl River Delta that was a higher priority for China to want to stabilize. But what we've seen is that China has been able to create its own hubs of its own right. I mean, you think about the city of Shenzhen, which is just right across the border to the north on the mainland in China. They have become a humongous tech hub. Baidu and even Shopify, the Canadian company, now has roots there. A lot of these e-commerce companies are stationed in Shenzhen. Whereas in Hong Kong, thought to be a long-time finance hub, a lot of those finance companies have pretty strong roots in Shanghai as well. So maybe for China, they can withstand a little bit of instability in Hong Kong, as we've seen over the last 24 weeks or so, because they understand that on the mainland, they're able to continue a lot of those activities, and that, who's to say the companies that are currently, in Hong Kong, they have large towers or large operations there, they could just relocate those people to the mainland and, run away from Hong Kong entirely. Now, I don't think we have anecdotal data that has suggested that companies are fleeing Hong Kong at the moment, but you do wonder to what degree, if these protests were to prolong even further, if companies would end up doing that.
And I mean, just from a personal front too, I mean, individuals fleeing as well. There are a lot of people who are just kind of there. I mean, you talk to people on the ground, 24 weeks of violence will certainly influence your decision whether or not you want to stay somewhere. But you mentioned e-commerce companies, you mentioned that whole shift in China, the big player Alibaba, clearly in a league of its own today. I want to highlight what that e-commerce giant is doing. It's breaking shopping records after a successful Singles Day, which included appearances from superstars like Kim Kardashian and Taylor Swift. The world's largest 24-hour shopping event officially ended earlier today, with the company bringing in a record $38.4 billion in sales. Brian, that broke last year's record of $30.7 billion. I mean, when you talk about Alibaba in the e-commerce space, clearly it's been pushing and battling. I mean, kind of putting Amazon's sales to shame here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to understand, too, that Alibaba is obviously the marketplace that's in China. A lot of American consumers might be watching this segment and going, man, this Singles Day must be a huge deal, but they don't really see it because they're not doing the shopping on Alibaba. For the most part, it's kind of pretty binary. Amazon is kind of the key e-commerce platform in the United States, whereas Alibaba and all the various platforms that they have is the primary e-commerce platform in China. But I think we need to understand that both of these stories are intertwined, not just simply because they're both massive e-commerce companies with unprecedented levels of scale, but also because they do have supply chains that are intertwined with one another, right? The same U.S. company that's selling socks or electronic goods are the same ones that are trying to export to the Chinese market just as aggressively as they are trying to sell domestically here in the United States.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
Yeah, and Alibaba, for what it's worth, they've been pushing really hard on getting a lot of those American brands, which in some cases are perceived in China to be higher quality premium products with a higher markup and a higher kind of profit margin, is something that they've been emphasizing too. So a lot of U.S. companies like a Mondelez, like a lot of the fashion brands or what have you have been really paying attention to what's going on with Alibaba, and I think the Singles Day hitting a record this year just reinforces how important and how high priority of a market China is.
Yeah, it's hard to overlook a $38 billion sales day. I mean,
a lot of bees.
It's not exactly something you can just say, oh yeah, we'll worry about that later. I mean, that is some clear momentum.